Recognized Uncle Walker D01. Recognized Gameable Saturday Morning D20. Initiate Part 2.
Let's take a step back for a second. So let's go back to the powers a little bit and reflect on those powers individually and their effects on storytelling and how they might reflect other characters that you may be trying to tell in your own stories or how they're used in Young Justice. Mm-hmm. Like the Wisdom of Solomon to me, in the episode they're sitting around the Justice League is sitting around trying to vote on who's going to be admitted into the Justice League. Mm-hmm. And they stumble across this conversation about Billy. The fact that they now know that Billy is a 10-year-old and that he's a kid and that Batman knew the whole time, et cetera, et cetera. It's a brilliant scene. It's mentioned, he does have the wisdom of Solomon, and then Aquaman says wisdom doesn't necessarily mean maturity. And I agree with that statement. I mean, technically it's true. But when you used an example earlier of like, oh, Billy's being tricked by someone, and then Captain Marvel can tell that he's being tricked and, helps him get out of it, seems more like life experience than it is about wisdom. Do you know what I mean? Like, what is wisdom? And having a couple of kids myself, the wisdom that comes out of their mouths sometimes is shocking and insightful. And to me, I like that version. That wisdom of Solomon needs to not be ignored. That childlike wisdom. I'm not a theology scholar, so I don't know all of the interpretations of Solomon's adult wisdom. But I don't know. So maybe that helps me and see this as Billy. The wisdom of Solomon is not something necessarily that Billy only gains when he's an adult. It's something that he owns and that he carries. And I like the idea that instead of having him becoming a different person, means that Billy never learns anything from the stuff that happens while Captain Marvel is there, unless he's like Dr. Fate and, he's in his head looking out and seeing what's happening and how they particularly play his memories of Captain Marvel's actions, I suppose. But it's still not him actively making choices. And that's the thing that I think that I want. It's like Captain Marvel becomes a supporting cast character in Billy's story, and you're then having the supporting cast character solve the problem where the protagonist does not. And there's a part of me that has an issue with that if that's an interpretation that isn't handled well.
Well, I think that you have to be careful with the line between Billy and Captain Marvel, because sometimes when they're very distinct, like in Jeff Smith's version, when they go to the Rock of Eternity, they can literally stand next to each other. Like they're that much two different individuals.
Yeah.
But even so, Captain Marvel is strongly coded as the grown-up Billy, like the better version of Billy that he aspires to be. So there is an interplay between those two characters, even if Billy is not literally making the decisions for Captain Marvel, which I think is arguable. I think you can argue that in some sense they share a consciousness, because Billy definitely remembers everything that happens as Captain Marvel, and he remembers it in first person, but he's in a different headspace because he is his grown-up self. So he makes a different decision than he maybe would have as Billy, but he remembers making it. But even if we have them as two different people, there is a sense in which we're telling a story about the same person diachronically in a weird way. And so if I think of like, what if I could summon myself from 10 years from now to make good decisions in my life? I mean, that would be an amazing superpower, and the whole story would be about me, even though one of the versions of me is from a later time. You as the consumer of media are still learning about me the whole story.
Which leads to down another rabbit hole. Because if the interpretation is that Captain Marvel is literally the adult lessened as in having learned lessons, I just made that word up apparently, an experienced version of Billy, then you start getting into time paradox questions. I mean, if he's literally coming from the future into the past type of a thing, as opposed to, is he a separate person that's separate from Billy, or a parallel universe maybe version of Billy might be like a different way to put it, which means that they live two separate lives, which means those things don't change.
Yeah, I think he's definitely not from the future. I think the alternate reality is closer to what's sometimes been portrayed. Mm-hmm. You have to go into your fairy tale brain. It is a child's idea of all the powers I'll have when I grow up. I'll know what to do when I grow up because I'll be a grown-up. That's what Captain Marvel is. He's me only as a grown-up, so he's not scared and he knows what to do.
Right. I hear that for sure. I'm thinking of it from the perspective of if I'm going to create a character or create a story or an idea that is playing with some of these Captain Marvel tropes, what are the things that I have to think about and what story elements do I want to focus on and like turn up and which ones do I want to turn down, depending on the kind of story you want to tell. I think it's absolutely fascinating that in this Jeff Smith version, they stand next to each other, can literally have a conversation. That's fascinating. I also find it fascinating, this Miracle Man or Sleepwalker version, where they don't communicate, like they have to leave messages for one another, meaning that they are two completely separate individuals. That could be interesting. The idea that Billy rides inside Captain Marvel's head while he's doing stuff, it's less interesting to me, but okay. But absolutely the most interesting thing to me is the idea of Billy still being Billy as an adult. And I think that's because I've seen interesting stories with that from Young Justice and Justice League Unlimited, and this idea that Captain Marvel, in that Superman story I was talking about, it's clearly Billy having an emotional reaction. It's not an adult alternate universe Shazam saying like, oh, Billy's going to be upset or,
right,
you know, that kind of thing.
And this all does, I mean, we're talking right now about wisdom, and that does, the use of that power hinges on your answer to this question. And like, I'm no theologian either, but to go to Solomon, for a character who is renowned for wisdom, Solomon makes an awful lot of bad decisions. Like, I think it is canonical in like the biblical sense that basically Solomon was spared for David's sake because Solomon made really bad choices. He reinstated the worship of idols in Israel. So he was granted wisdom, but that didn't necessarily mean that he made all the right choices. And sometimes
interesting,
Captain Marvel's power has been portrayed that way, that like he has access to the right answer. That's basically what the wisdom means, is that if he wants to bother to know what he should do, then he can find out. But he's still Billy, and sometimes Billy may be too impetuous or too emotionally motivated to listen to his own wisdom, which is, I think, it's a way to tell a story about a Captain Marvel who is truly Billy, yet also has wisdom, is to say, basically, it's a door in his mind that he can open, that he may sometimes just decide, you know what, screw it, I don't want to do the wise thing, I'm too mad.
Interesting. I'm not sure how I feel about that interpretation. I like the idea of focusing it, I think, on the protagonist. I guess I like the idea that he doesn't have to go somewhere else for the wisdom. He's wise on his own. I like that the thing you referenced earlier about Billy being a competent character in and of himself, which we see, in this episode where Billy is trying to get to, the up to the Watchtower, but it's not the Zeta tubes aren't going to work for him, and then he has to get to Happy Harbor and the whole deal. Like, Billy's competent. Kid's getting himself to across the country, right? And I like that idea. And the wisdom aspect of it, I guess I just want kids to have more respect on that wisdom aspect. And as much as I love Aquaman, though his comment was technically true about the maturity versus wisdom, I was very dismissive of they've already worked with Captain Marvel for a long time at that point, and they have seen him be successful and do the things he's doing, but they immediately start talking down to him in that episode, which bothers me.
What this I promise will be a very short tangent. What this reminds me of most is a discussion I once heard. I went for some time to a community college where there are different kind of like criteria for who gets into classes because there's public funding, and so it has to be open to people who can meet certain requirements.
Yeah. So
there were some overeager parents trying to get their very, very young children into community college courses. Like, I'm talking like 5 or 6 years old. And there was an issue with it because it's like, we have to be able to legally show that they can't do that, because if they're capable of it, we have to let them in because of the funding and like our mandate.
Okay.
And there was basically a question of like, okay, math is one thing, but can we have a 6-year-old in a literature class for adults? Because no matter how smart this kid is, like, she's never been in love. I mean, she doesn't.
There's no frame of reference for.
Yeah. And so there is a question here of like, when Billy turns into Captain Marvel, does he know what it's like to be in long-term love with someone? Does he know what it's like to experience tragedy in the way that an adult does? That's all a part of wisdom. It's hard to imagine it being imparted with magic. So if we're going to think of it in that level, it's like,
interesting.
I mean, maybe Aquaman is right in the sense that if there are certain things that you have to experience to know about them, and the magic does not cause Billy to have experienced them.
Right. I think my concern is his choice of words. Like if he had said wisdom does not mean experience, I'm on board. But that's not what he said. He said wisdom does not mean maturity. And I can tell you right now, my 4-year-old daughter is more mature than a significant portion of people that I have met in my life, I'm sorry to say. She makes very good decisions. She thinks things through. She's very perceptive. And this idea of, that brings up again, maybe a philosophical or theological question. Part of the aspect of advisors to communities, so say things like a priest or something that has a tenet to somewhat separate themselves from their community that they are actually advising. So the idea of, like, I guess a Catholic priest who's not supposed to marry, or shaman from various cultures actually living in the society but separate from the society, gives them the perspective, the wisdom, and the separation from the actual emotional drama of what's happening to be able to impart that wisdom and insight. And so, to me, this idea of Billy, I think it's important what you're saying, for sure. I also think that it's important to not ignore the fact he hasn't experienced these things, maybe where some of this wisdom is coming from, because it's giving him an outside perspective on bad choices that, say Hal Jordan is going to make because he's thinking with his libido instead of something else. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I love that. And I think that would be a great way to do it, especially because you were talking earlier about the scene between like Superman and Shazam. Like, why would you do this to a child? Shazam chooses Billy, and it has to be Billy, and he chooses him at the moment of his death. And the question of why that is something that's open about the character. You can decide based on your portrayal what you want it to be. Absolutely, a part of it could be, this is a child who has experienced enough to have grown up. Like, he's had a hard life and he has shown courage and resilience, but he isn't innocent. And he hasn't gone through all the things that an adult has, and he hasn't become jaded. It may be that the wisdom of Solomon and the courage of Achilles have to start at that age. Like, it has to be Billy, because if it were, let's say, like, Hal Jordan, as good a guy as he is in certain ways,
right,
he will never be able to access that wisdom because he's too much in it. I think you're right. That's a great take on the character.
Yeah. Well, then let's move on to some other things. I don't know if I have too much to add about the strength of Hercules, although, again, not being an expert on Hercules, I still think of Hercules as a really strong, potentially like superhuman strength person. I mean, he did, the 12, it's 12, right? 12.
He did the ordeals, yeah.
12 ordeals of Hercules, yeah.
Hercules is certainly super strong, and I think at least within like DC Comics continuity, it's very clear like he is a demigod, and Captain Marvel's strength is like top tier, but it's like I think he's almost as strong as Superman, but like I think they've arm wrestled and it was basically a stalemate, but Captain Marvel had to try harder. I think that's where they're at. They're like right there,
right? But
that's not as important, I think, as what you can do with that strength, and it is like, I think the wandering, monster slaying, jovial Hercules is the archetype for what you use Captain Marvel's strength for in a story.
Yeah.
And that plays a little into like wisdom and maturity and like being a part of things. It makes me think a little of how Connor's powers are used, that like the fact that he can't fly is like so symbolically important with his connection to Superman.
Right.
Connor is in it. And he doesn't have distance. He has to get in it. He doesn't have heat vision. He doesn't have flight. So Superman gets to be this iconic figure who is above it all, and not Connor. In the same way, when you give somebody all this strength, this tremendous amount of strength, it's part of the original iconic appeal of Superman. This is a place where I think the superhero genre owes everything to Superman, because it is the fantasy of a child growing up, especially I think in an urban environment, to say everything here is bigger than me and I can't affect it. I just bounce right off it. But what if I could run faster than a train? Like, what if I could lift a skyscraper the way that I can lift my toys at home? Like, what if I could move this stuff? Like, I would be a real grown-up. I'd be striding across the world like a giant, Right. That's Hercules. That's like the man who tosses lions around and redirects rivers and isn't dwarfed by the world. And that's Captain Marvel. I want to see that from Captain Marvel stories.
Yeah, it seems like there are, though of course each of these aspects of him are tied to theoretically a specific power. I like this idea that it's more than just the strength of Hercules, it's Hercules. It's the platonic representation of Hercules, not just his strength, but that, like you said, like the jovialness in the heat of battle or stress or combat that relieves the stress and strain of his colleagues. You know what I mean? Or that all of the other aspects, the presence, and I don't know, like when he's there and present, you feel better. And it's different to me than Superman. It's like the difference between how Dick Grayson leads versus how Bruce leads, right? When Superman shows up, you feel better because Superman can take care of business and you know that he's got the power to do it. When Shazam shows up, you just feel better about life. Yeah. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're just like, there's everything about this person who just makes you feel like life could be more ideal and better if we were just made better choices or different choices or chose to be better to one another. You know, that's part of the strength as well. Does that make sense? I might be digging a little bit, but
I get you exactly. It's a trope, it's an archetype, and it is specifically a role, a literary role that we're familiar with that immediately casts him in that light for us. And that's what this elusiveness of the powers does, is it tells us this is going to be this kind of story. You've always heard these stories of, like, you know, this Hercules, this big strong guy who's like untouchably strong and shows up and kind of makes light of problems in addition to solving them. Like, it's no problem when Hercules is here. Right. In a certain way. At least that's a strain of, you know, Hercules stories. Obviously, his ordeals are a little more serious for him, but for regular people who cross his path, you know, everything's easy when Hercules shows up. And yeah, you're right. Captain Marvel's the same, and it's different from other superheroes, for sure.
It's like part of the strength of being able to solve the problem is believing that it can be solved. You know, that kind of thing. So moving on to Atlas, when we got to Atlas, the first kind of story idea that popped into my head was this unlimited constitution, he never gets tired thing is fascinating to me. Like, I can see, like, okay, so Superman, if Superman can out-arm wrestle Captain Marvel, right? Getting super geeky here, guys. If he can out-arm wrestle Captain Marvel, really all Captain Marvel has to do is his best, the best he can possibly do, and do that forever. And then he's going to beat Superman. Like, if Superman can't quite get him all the way to the table, he's going to win. Shazam's going to win, right? Or if, like, if there's a building that's going to crush a bunch of people, barring the weird physics of holding up a building that's not designed to be held that way. But like, if there's some crazy weight that's going to crush a bunch of people, and you're going to choose one person to lift it and keep it lifted, and one person to fight the bad guy, you'll probably choose, like, Captain Marvel. I can see him flying in and say, Superman, I got this. Yeah. You know, go do your thing, because I will just hold it and never break a sweat and have a nice, calm and peaceful, presence-filled, uplifting conversation with the people who are hoping they don't get crushed by this thing I'm holding up. And, you know, increasing their morale, you know, while Superman goes off to do his thing. It's interesting how these different views or interpretations of powers can be made so much more interesting by stopping and thinking a little deeper about the various consequences of what they are, and not just grabbing that first cliche, oh, they're basically the same, so we'll just have them fight, because that's the only story I can think of.
Yeah, especially when you've got an ensemble story, or you're trying to do a different take on a character than is traditional. You're right, digging in and seeing, like, the little nuances, it means a lot. We see that all the time all over Young Justice. Like, I loved, it's not precisely superpowers, but, like, it kind of is. Abracadabra versus Clarion, and how, like, this is fake magic that's actually science, and this is real magic, and how that influences Wally, and how, like, his worldview will accept one and just not the other.
Right.
You know, there's all kinds of times that we see the distinctions of different powers, or, like, the interactions among the different Flashes toward the end of the second season, and, like, where their different powers are at, their power levels, and how they use them, and all those things.
Right.
You know, I really like Wally's portrayal particularly, and, like, that's a big character thing for him. Like, I mean, it is important for Wally that he's not quite there power-wise. He's not quite on that level. Like, that's huge.
And I think, can we stick with Wally for a minute? Yeah. Wally in that Flash for a second? Because I think that Emily, nod to Emily, who brought this up to me, which I found really interesting. The episode where the team is, Tim Drake's leading a team that's infiltrating the plant that's creating the Reach drink, right? And they're trying to escape. I think somebody turns to Impulse and says, can you pick them up and run with them? And Impulse is like, I'm fast, not strong. And it's interesting because Emily pointed out to me, that's a thing Wally does all the time.
Yeah.
Like, he is constantly running with other people, like, you know, Robin on his back and running at full speed, giving Robin the inertia to go do a bunch of stuff. Like, we used it in our Masks game as well. Like, it's interesting when you kind of dial it in and see what you can do that makes things different and the importance of what that difference is in these power sets. And then in addition to that, Impulse being basically more powerful than Wally can be frustrating for Wally fans, but I find it really interesting that at the end of season 2, when Wally basically offers the Kid Flash mantle to Impulse because he wants to retire, Impulse is so excited about it. Like, he's so jazzed about the honor to take Wally's place in this costume when Wally clearly does not have the power level of Impulse. Do you know what I mean? It becomes more about their interpersonal interactions and who Wally is as a person that Impulse wants to emulate, not necessarily the powers.
Yeah, and that is the perspective of a person with the privilege of power, which is something that we sometimes see in superhero stories. Superman is a person who respects other people. And part of that is the privilege of not having to worry about other people hurting him very much. Like, he's grown up with responsibility and not had to worry about really getting, like, you know, picked on or abused or whatever. The question is, you know, what can I do? Because I can do so much and I have so much more than other people. That leads you to respect the people who haven't been gifted in the same way you have if you're a good and conscientious person.
Right.
Whereas if you're that underdog, sometimes it's a little bit harder to get over the power differential. It's like class is more of a thing for people who are on the losing end of it. It's a little harder to escape.
Right.
And some of my favorite characters, you know, to talk about, you know, my old favorites, the Golden Age Atom. I mean, basically his superpower is that he's like 5'0" nothing. And it's like,
oh, you're talking about the Justice Society Atom that's just basically a short boxer?
He's a short boxer. That's his superpower. And it's like, yeah, you know, what are you doing in the Justice Society? Why do you fight crime? Because I'm a 5-foot tall boxer. That's why. Because it's the world. It's the Second World War. The world is going to hell. Like, American cities are corrupted, full of crime. The world's probably going to end because the Nazis are on the loose. Right. And you know what? Everybody needs to get in there. Like, I'm a person with every natural disadvantage, basically. Like, I was born to fight and I'm 5'0" nothing. So I have to fight people. I got to get out there and punch whoever I can reach. Right.
What's extra funny about that is he wasn't the only boxer on the team either. Right?
Exactly.
So there's Wildcat, who is the tall boxer, and Adam, who is the short boxer. And I don't think there was any other difference between the two of them except their costumes. I could be wrong. I would be interested to go back and read to see what's going on. But yeah, that's really funny.
Yeah, and so sometimes it's the lack of powers, but yeah, that different role that they play. And to get back to Atlas, I think it goes to your role in the story, because part of the thing about Superman, to me, it's important that Superman eventually gets tired, because part of the Superman mythos is Superman is only one man, and that's his mission, and that's part of telling interesting Superman stories, is that Superman can't feed the world, he can't fix everything. So he has to use the immense power he has to get other people to do good while he has to sleep, right? Like, he's only in one place at a time.
Right.
Captain Marvel's role in the story is he's the cavalry coming in. Basically, that's not part of the Captain Marvel story. He is not like, I think he comes to the rescue. He is like, he saves the day. He's your better self. And therefore, he never gets tired. So it's like he's finally, ultimately reliable. And can fight the good fight forever. His weakness is Billy, like, in a certain sense, you know. But we're not really telling the story where Captain Marvel needs to get other people in on the act, which is such a big part of Superman.
Well, this actually brought something up for me. Like, I was just talking about the idea of how much I really appreciate and like the version of Shazam where Billy is still Billy. Like, his brain is the same, but he's in the adult body, which makes me think, here's the hole with that. The problem with that. Why would he ever turn back? You can give some general reasons, but my quick, spin around Billy's life tells me that he probably wouldn't necessarily want to turn back or need to turn back, where if he is a separate person or even an older version of himself and he's riding inside, then you get the Dr. Fate moral question of like, no, Billy wants to go back to his life, and he's just taken Captain Marvel for a spin. Mm-hmm. But if he's turned into Captain Marvel, if he is himself with an adult body, but the rest of his mind is the same, he might miss a few of his friends. But I don't remember Billy having a lot of like, he has no family, and he's traveling around the world with, you know, this performing monkey or whatever he's doing that issue. You know, if it's actually him in there, why would he turn back? Like,
and that's a plot point in Miracle Man.
Is it? Oh, because
yeah.
see, like this whole idea of endurance, I was thinking like, okay, yeah, Superman needs to sleep, so he's got to inspire. I get that. That sounds fantastic. But that also means Shazam never has to stop, right? Captain Marvel never has to stop. He can just keep going 24/7. If you're saying like he doesn't have to eat, sleep, you know, do any of this stuff, he could just go 24/7, which means why would Billy turn back if he could? Maybe that is that kind of the story, the idea that he could go 24/7 and.
It's, I believe, and I'm not very familiar with Miracle Man, but my understanding is it's the Captain Marvel Jr. / Mary Marvel analog who ultimately decides not to turn back. And then you have the inverse in Kingdom Come where, you know, he grows up as Billy and decides not to be Captain Marvel. But there are a ton of ways you could go with this in a story, certainly. And you could do sort of like, there was that Superman 24/7 storyline where like Superman just was Superman all the time. Captain Marvel could do that and make it work. The issue is, again, it's about story. In the Golden Age, Billy wouldn't do that because Billy had a job. Billy was a kid with a job, and that job was not just hanging out with performing monkeys, although that's a perk. He also was out doing like war reporting and things like that. So like
right.
Billy had a real life that was very fulfilling to him, and it was what he wanted to do.
Right. And we're talking about at that time, and if in that time period he was not Billy inside, like he was not Billy as an adult, he was a ride-along. He's going to want to go back to that job. He wants to go back to that life that he had before because he doesn't just want to be a ride-along. You know, like, it's cool, but then I also want to have my own life.
Again, we can think of the literal implications. We can also think of sort of the trope, and we can think of the symbolism. If this is, in some sense, about your two selves, like your childhood self and your adult self, and like that whole, and your better self and your maybe your weaker self in some regard, in
right.
any of those cases, the power comes with responsibility, right? If you could just be a grown-up when you needed to reach stuff on a tall shelf or solve a difficult problem, and
right.
then go back to being a kid in your leisure time, why wouldn't you do that? Why would you want to be a grown-up and have a job all the time? Because Captain Marvel is a highly responsible individual. He is tasked, like he is heir to the mantle of Hercules and Atlas. Like he has work to do. But not so much Billy. Billy's life is fun. Even though he has a job, it's a fun job.
Which is interesting to me because I look at that as a very adult perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And by all means, challenge me on this. But I see that as an adult perspective on Billy's situation and not a 10-year-old kid's perspective on Billy's situation. Like as he turns into an adult and can run around and be a quote-unquote adult who never has to eat, never has to sleep, like never has to have like a job to pay bills, I think that he would do that. He might clearly do that for like a year before he realizes what's going on, or that maybe there should be other changes that he does. Like he can skip all the parts that you don't like. I hated high school. With very few exceptions of things happening in high school, and middle school was near nightmarish. You know, why wouldn't I skip all that? And just because as a kid, I'd be like, man, I wish I was a grown up. And as a grown up, you're like, man, I wish I was back at being a kid again with no responsibilities and fun. I guess I'd be interested to see if he'd do that, or if there's a time in which he tried it, and what the reason was he chose not to continue doing it. Sounds like an interesting story arc to me.
Yeah, and it goes to the story of Atlas too, because you're right that he could do it because of his endless endurance. Yet, if we turn to the story of Atlas and Hercules, we see that at a certain point that becomes tiresome. And so it would be interesting, to do a story where Billy does just think, you know, the stuff going on for Billy right now is not great. Let me just be Captain Marvel and be a crime fighter and hang out with the Justice League all the time. And I think that may sound good to a 10-year-old or an 8-year-old, but after a certain amount of time of being expected to show up when there's trouble, of being expected to hold up your end of things like a grown-up, I think you would say, you know what, let me just go like back to my apartment where I have my room and that's like my only job is to kind of keep it clean, and that's all people expect from me, really. That sounds great right about now, after, you know, my 6th hour of being on watch duty in the watchtower and all that.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, let's round out some of these other powers a bit. So the power of Zeus, to me, that was very, you know, nebulous, as you had mentioned. But you opened up the door to some really interesting ideas. If you start to relate the power of Zeus not just to, you know, the kind of, again, first thing off the cliche shelf, which is, oh, he can throw lightning bolts or do lightning-y powers, right? But you open that up to, no, there's a mystical connection. The same way that we did with, like, say, the presence of and personality of Hercules is as much his strength as his physical strength. Then with Zeus, it's not just his, you know, throwing lightning, but also just this mastery of magic, and or even the shape-changing aspect of Billy turning into Captain Marvel and back, I also see as being, you know, an aspect of Zeus, who is a consummate and annoying shape changer, you know, in his stories.
There have been some versions of the character where Captain Marvel can actually call the lightning to transform into like different outfits for like undersea adventures and stuff, and that's power of Zeus because of the shape changing connection.
Whoa! If Captain Marvel grew up and started having, like, he could call the lightning and turn into other things like animals and stuff, oh my god! It's almost like I've been reading a 70-year-old prequel to this character. Do you know what I mean? Like, as he gets, if we let him grow up and get older and experience what he can potentially experience, like his story and power set can become crazy. Like, fascinating.
Yeah, this is a hell of a hand that he's drawn on powers, and the power of Zeus is basically a wild card. As a writer, you can do whatever you want with the power of Zeus. And sometimes I think if we're going to talk about iconography, it is just straight up supremacy. Especially, like, his tagline is like the world's mightiest mortal. And that works better when he's in his own universe than when he's in the DC universe. Right. But in the Golden Age stories, really what I get from Power of Zeus is like Zeus is the king of the gods, the father of the gods. Like he's the top. He's the sovereign. Captain Marvel is like just the best. He's just straight up the best. You try to do things to other people. A lot of stories basically just come down to like, oh, I'm an evil hypnotist. I'm going to hypnotize everyone. And then they try to hypnotize Captain Marvel. But at the end of the day, it's like, sorry, buddy, I'm Captain Marvel. I have the power of Zeus. I'm the best. You know, he always is just going to come out on top. And I think it's canonical currently that like only the very strongest magic, like I think it takes like the Specter to do magical stuff to Captain Marvel because he's just, the power of Zeus just blocks it.
That's literally the power of the Christian God, right? Because Specter is an angel of God, like a superhero powered directly by God. Yeah. So unless God personally intervenes, basically using the Specter as an appendage, then Captain Marvel doesn't need to worry too much about magical interference, which is nice. You know, Shazam is a big gun, and he gets his power from there. We don't see Specter in Young Justice, but if you want just a quick idea of a pretty cool interpretation of the Specter, go find the DC Showcase animated short.
Ooh, yeah.
It's good, but it's also scary. Like, the Specter is not an angel of hugging and happiness. The Specter is the spirit of vengeance, and how that gets interpreted. Also, go find the Batman Brave and the Bold episode. Oh God, what was it called? Chill of the Night?
I don't think I know this one.
Oh my gosh, have you not seen that?
I've seen the showcase, but not the...
Okay, so in my personal opinion, it is one of the best written Batman stories ever. And it was in Batman Brave and the Bold. And it's about the Specter, who is the spirit of vengeance, basically talking to Batman about vengeance and his moral quandary about what he's doing, and can he or should he let go of the death of his parents. You should definitely go look that. Just go find it and watch that one. It's good, but it's also a good, look into the Specter, which again, when we're talking about the interesting idea where you have like a character like Superboy or Miss Martian in the same group as a character like Artemis or Robin, who have no powers, right? Mm-hmm. And we were just talking about two boxers in the Justice Society who were fighting alongside the Specter, who we've just described, Dr. Fate, and the original Green Lantern, Alan Scott. And then you had a couple boxers and Black Canary, who didn't have a canary cry back in the day and was just like I don't even know what she did, honestly. She was kind of a fighter. So they were
Yeah.
basically like 3 gods or demigods and 3 like boxers.
Yeah, and don't forget Johnny Thunder.
Oh yeah, Johnny Thunder, and of course Johnny Thunder, who was also basically the literal genie in a bottle with all kinds of magical powers. And then I also forgot, you also had Sandman, who was just like a dude with a gas mask and some sleeping powder.
Yeah, very, very huge power disparity there, yes.
Yeah, it's hilarious, but also canonical and awesome. Or Dr. Midnight, whose power was, I can see at night, right?
And not during the day. I mean, he had zero-sum powers, yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. He had zero-sum powers, right? And Hourman, who had a drug who would give him like Captain America level powers, like physical prowess for an hour.
Yes.
And that was all. Basically, he took drugs. He just had a pill. Yeah. So anyway, it's a bit of an aside, but it kind of is reflective of the age in which Captain Marvel was created. You know, like...
Yes, and this would be a wonderful time to move on to the Courage of Achilles. Because we're talking about powers that affect tone now. And you can see I really enjoyed how Young Justice was able to work in a lot of different tones into something that felt cohesive. And I think that part of that, the diversity of powers and power levels in the DC universe really helps you to do that. Because you can take the same setting and situations, but by slotting in different characters with different abilities, sometimes something can seem very light and other times it can seem very dire, depending on what you're bringing to the situation. And Captain Marvel is a great way to address that, because if you want to do a story where we don't need to worry about fear, then use Captain Marvel, because he isn't afraid. Or I think you could make the interpretation that he's not distressed, or you could make the interpretation that he is never hindered by fear.
There you go. Because the whole idea to me of courage or bravery is 100% dependent on feeling fear. Mm-hmm. Ignoring fear or being immune to fear, as, you know, like the D&D paladin kind of a power or ability, if it's stretched into more than just immune to supernatural fear, and it's kind of stretched into the day-to-day life of I am not afraid of anything, that doesn't mean you have courage necessarily, because courage is required to have the fear and then choose to face it anyway. So to me, the Courage of Achilles should be more reflective on the idea that to me it's more interesting, maybe I should say, that he feels the fear, he registers the fear, he has Billy's reaction to things with that fear, but he has that extra boost of like, I can do this. But I mean, if you're near invulnerable and you're super speed fast and everything else, of course you're going to have more courage. So I would look at it that way, and then as a writer, I would look at it that way and say, okay, so let's get a little more granular with this courage and find out what it really means for it to be an aspect of his powers. Not just, you're near invulnerable, so of course you're going to not worry about walking into that building full of guys with guns, you know, or like, does it stretch out to other people? Does he have that wisdom of Solomon aspect of him that helps other people, give them the confidence to face their fears? You know, those kinds of ideas might be more interesting to me as a storyteller.
Yeah, it's difficult because on the one hand, it feels like this is taking something out of your palette as a storyteller if we're doing a story about Captain Marvel, because fear is so fundamental,
right,
that if we take it away, it feels like it's diminishing stakes in a certain way. And it depends on what kind of story you're trying to tell. Like, not every story needs to be deep and psychological, and oftentimes the stories about Captain Marvel are just fun stories about things happening in the world, like a wacky set of circumstances. So sometimes taking fear out of the equation makes those stories easier to tell. Like, there's a classic Captain Marvel story, one actually where he does briefly have a moment of like nervousness in retrospect at the end. It's actually kind of funny. An inventor invents something called atomic fire that burns atoms, and so there's no way to put it out. Literally any matter will just burn, and tries to basically like sell it to the military. They don't buy it, and so he tries to give them a demonstration, accidentally sets the world on fire. Oops. And he can't put it out because he's got the what's supposed to be the cure for it, but it doesn't work. It doesn't put it out. So Captain Marvel, he solves the problem, right? Ultimately, I think he has to take like a big chunk of the Earth out and just like huck it into space with the atomic fire on it. And then at the end, there's like a little bit where somebody's like, Captain Marvel, what's wrong? And he's like, oh, well, now that I solved the problem, I just had a minute to think about it, and I realized that the world almost ended. So that's a little scary.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to do a story with a threat quite that dire, but you don't want the story to be gloom and doom, then you can use Captain Marvel for it because he's not afraid. I think maybe more powerfully, you can use him in a story where it is about fear and he is one perspective to it. So for example, I love the way that Batman stories, they revolve around fear. Like to me, that is one of the fundamental differences between Batman and his Robins is that his world revolves around fear. Right. And theirs doesn't, in large part because he's a good dad. You know, whatever else.
Hopefully, depending on his interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, he's done better and worse things, but at the end of the day, there's something deep in your upbringing that like whether you have fear at the center of your world in that way.
Right.
And he does, and I feel like particularly Dick does not and could have. And so if we have a character like that who like fear is central to him, it's interesting to have a foil in Captain Marvel who he may be able to feel like, oh, this is bad news, you know, but he's never going to be impaired by fear, and he's never going to, fear is not going to be a central motivation for him in quite the same way. I feel like, I don't know if you've ever read I think it was Grant Morrison's Arkham Asylum Batman story.
Maybe, it's a while ago.
Yeah, it's a cool story. It's kind of a one-off. Batman gets basically blackmailed into going into Arkham when the inmates have taken over. Yeah. And it's this weird like psychodrama where Joker is basically like tearing the mask away figuratively and like prodding at Batman at his most sensitive psychological points.
Right.
That's always on the edge of happening with Batman because of that central, he became the fear in the night, right? That's his world. But for Captain Marvel, it's like no matter how bad things get, there is hope at the core. Or at least there is like Achilles. I mean, Achilles, you know, spoilers for the Iliad, guys. Achilles dies at the end.
Right.
I mean, not of the Iliad, actually, but of the story. But he goes on. I mean, the same theme holds true with Hector. There is this thing of like, you get in there, you do it, and that's heroism. And ultimately, the things you're afraid of don't have power over you if you go be a hero. And that's at the core of Captain Marvel to me.
Yeah. It's interesting, the description of the idea where he's like, oh, the world almost ended, and now that I'm thinking about it, that could have gone terribly wrong, right? Mm-hmm. I mean... So I was an ICU nurse and a code nurse, meaning that I was trained to, when somebody had a code blue somewhere in the hospital, whether they had a heart attack or a respiratory problem or something like that, whether it was a patient or whether it was like a patient's family member, which periodically happened, I would be the code nurse for the day in the ICU. The code got called, and I would get the gear and I would go down to what was happening. Along with like a team of people, we would show up from all over the hospital, and then we would run this code and try and help this person. Mm-hmm. Being in that code wasn't an issue, right? Being in the situation where someone's life is literally in your hands and dependent on your skills and abilities and stuff, it can be nervous at first, and then you become more skilled at it and more experienced at it, and you do it, but every single time, an hour or 2 hours later, that's when the adrenaline dump stops, right? The adrenaline stops pumping, and your brain is it comes out of the zone, and then you can start shaking, you know, or like reflecting on what happened and what you did and what you didn't do and what you could have done or maybe didn't, you know, that kind of stuff. We had a medical emergency with my daughter when she was about 3. She had knocked herself unconscious and had stopped breathing. I just went into emergency mode to get it done, right? Like, she ended up waking up and, you know, that kind of thing. And we had the EMTs here, and they checked her out. She was perfectly fine. Intellectually, I knew she was fine. But about 45 minutes after the EMTs left, I was crying in the bed, right? You know, where my wife, when it was happening, who is not a panicky person in any way, was understandably freaking out, right? And in the moment. So it's interesting, that idea that I wasn't afraid for my daughter in that moment, but I became retroactively scared of all of the potential things that could have happened. And then my brain goes down those roads. So how that fits into this interpretation of courage versus, you know, courage and fear and lack of fear or never feeling fear, and how that can roll into a story of Captain Marvel or any character that you're writing where this is a thing, right? Or like I said, like a paladin story or somebody under a spell that makes you immune to fear. You know, I don't know. That was, sorry, it's a bit of an aside, but like,
no, I think it's absolutely relevant, and it's so human, and that's why this is like, I mean, Kingdom Come does this to a certain extent. I mean, we just talked about it, and when he's out there being Captain Marvel, he's fine, but when he stops and goes back to Billy and thinks about what could have gone wrong,
Yes.
he doesn't want to say that magic word again, which I imagine is probably the same for people who have jobs where they're often in those situations. It's
What a
maybe
great point.
the
Oh, I
moments
love that.
in between, because the thing is, it's the message of hope of Captain Marvel, and it's what he has in common with Achilles, which we may initially think like, wait a minute, Achilles? Like, really? I mean, does he have a lot to do with Captain Marvel? But it is that heroism, and the message is, you can do it. You can be a hero. Go do it. To do that, you need courage, because to go out there takes courage. To put yourself in that position takes courage. When the moment comes, you have the power to do it. You can act, but the fear will take you out if you don't have the courage.
Right.
And yeah, that's superhero storytelling. And I think the fact that Captain Marvel's on the losing end of that in Kingdom Come is a great example of how to do a darker story using the character of Captain Marvel, which is rarely done, but can be done very effectively.
Yeah, interesting. To me, it's fascinating because we deal with that at the role-playing game table a lot. At least I have over the decades I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons, because of the whole paladin thing, where people think this immune to fear means that you're an idiot.
Yeah, like I don't know better. I don't know I'm in danger.
I'm immune to the dragon's fear, which means I'm going to do the worst thing possible. That doesn't even make any sense. Like, you can be immune to the fear of walking across the street. That doesn't mean you're going to walk in front of a car. You know, like it's led to some very painful, like late in the middle of the night debates on, you know, paladins being lawful stupid, you know, and that kind of thing. So
it ties into the kind of ethics, and not to go on too much of a tangent here, but I think it does connect to Captain Marvel as well, and it connects to the ethical complexities of Young Justice. There is a basically deontological approach to ethics that some heroes have, and it is that, like, this is what we do. I am not a consequentialist. This is what we do. And the consequences be damned, because right is right and good is good, and this is what we do. If you embrace those ethics, that is an ethics of faith and an ethics of hope, as vulnerable as it is to being subverted. That's the ethos of a paladin. It is, no, I will not poison the evil king and save the kingdom from his depredations. I know he's about to kill them all. I know the way to get him is poison, but that's not what we do. Mm-hmm. And that goes with fearlessness, because that is, I may not win. I may not kill the dragon, but this is what we do. Right. So here I go. It doesn't mean that you're not smart. It doesn't mean that you're going to take a suboptimal approach, or that you don't realize the dragon's breath is dangerous. But at the end of the day, you're going to do what is your job.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, let's move on to the last power here, which is this speed of Mercury aspect. What I have to say only has a reflection of what we've already talked about, with the idea that, okay, he's going to be slow and steady, wins the race against Flash, right?
Right.
But we've never really seen Flash get... Well, that's not true. Seeing Flash get tired is unusual. You know, it's an unusual story arc choice, unless there was Doom. So Justice League Doom, which is an animated series that was animated movie that was based on the comic. In Doom, the Justice League discovered that Batman had contingency plans in place in case any of the more powerful, which means pretty much everybody, members of the League, went rogue or had a problem or whatever. Batman knew exactly how to take down and or kill all of them. And that those contingency plans get into the hands of, if I remember correctly, Vandal Savage. And they start implementing them. Mm-hmm. And the one aspect of the Flash, what happened with the Flash, was the idea of basically the speed conundrum, right? So he's got a bomb attached to him, and if he slows beneath a particular speed, it will go off. And in that, part of the drama is, you know, when will he get tired? When will he get tired? How long will that take? That becomes part of the drama, but that type of story is unusual for the Flash, because he would like sprint around, you know, Las Vegas looking for all of Joker's bombs, you know, and be back in, you know, seconds, you know, in the Justice League animated series. I'm doing a lot of animated references because I'm assuming that people have seen those, or not assuming, but they're easier to get a hold of than some of the story, you know, maybe comics we're talking about in decades of history. How do you look at this particular power? Is it anything that's unusual in any way than any other, say, speedster or character like Wonder Woman or Superman, who has, like, you know, quote unquote, is a speedster? I'm reluctant to use that phrase because I don't see Superman as a speedster, but I think although he does use a lot of the speedster powers.
It's interesting to make that distinction. And I think that's exactly where it is. I don't think it is very different from what Superman has in this instance. I think it's just about the same. the interesting thing is why he has it and how that's different from a character like the Flash. Because, characters like the Flash who are defined by that speed ability, a lot of their storytelling potential lies in the use of that power. We don't really see it deployed in the same way with a character like Superman commonly, because Superman has other things going on. He's conceptualized in a different way. So a lot of times when it seems like he would be using that speed to great effect, like you think of like, well, how would Flash deal with, if Flash had to fight the Hulk, how would he do it? But then when you think of Superman fighting the Hulk, it's like, well, he's not as fast as the Flash, but he's a damn sight faster than the Hulk. So, but it's just not what you think of, because it's not like at the top of his list of powers.
Right.
I think with Captain Marvel, it's the same story. I think he has the speed of Mercury because he is at his heart, a wish fulfillment character that is about a better self. And to fulfill that, and especially to like tie into the community the way he does, like he does a lot of stuff for people. He is like a public hero in his original Inception.
Yeah.
He needs to be able to like take care of it all. And the speed powers are really useful for that. So, he can go all around the city to do whatever.
Right.
It helps keep him from that situation where he needs to get a bunch of people to help him, because he's the cavalry, right? Like he's the one who gets called in.
Right.
That's how the story's constructed.
I think I agree with you. I like that reflection you made earlier on when we first started talking about this idea that he used it more as a utilitarian ability. Mm-hmm. This idea of, I will be able to build this homeless shelter faster.
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to, all the ways that Flash uses his powers.
Yeah, and he used it to travel as well. That was the other big one. I feel like, Captain Marvel is super fast in the same way that like early Doctor Who, the Doctor can time travel. Like, he doesn't really use it to solve individual problems. He uses it to get from adventure to adventure, or if an adventure ends in a messy way, to fix it so he can just move on.
Right.
But he doesn't really use it in the middle very much. It's sort of that kind of thing,
That's an interesting observation about Doctor Who that I don't think I quite codified in my head, but yeah, you're right. That's true.
Yeah, I mean, think of how many decades it took for Doctor Who to actually start being about time travel on a week-to-week basis. It's kind of crazy.
Right. Yeah, interesting. All right, fascinating. I just had one more thing just to throw out there for our listeners, which is the interesting fact that there are the standard designations for the Young Justice team, or the Justice League, or the DC Universe in Young Justice. There's the team, which are the B as in boy designations. There's the C designations, which were for the pets. So Sphere and Wolf are C01 and C02. But there are the A designations. The A designations are actually authorized guests, and they start with, like Snapper Carr, right? And Catherine Colbert, who's their public liaison, right? And then you get Zatanna, and you get, that kind of thing. But Billy Batson is added after that episode that we were just talking about the fact that he couldn't get anywhere because he hadn't been scanned as Billy Batson. So Billy's A05, but what's fascinating to me is that Freddie Freeman is A06 and Mary Bromfeld is A07, and they both have designations before Mal. Huh. So Mal is actually A10, and there is no listed, according to the YJ Wiki, there's no reference for any listings for A08 or A09. So we don't know who they may potentially be.
Dudley and Hoppy, obviously.
Oh, yeah, clearly. Yeah.
Being
Hoppy,
an anthropomorphic bunny, I mean, I see where that's a gray area, but I feel like that's an A. If you can come in like a nice suit and vest, you're an A.
Then we're going to start getting Captain Carrot and the Zoo Crew crossovers and a whole bunch of other stuff, which I think might end up being more like episode 6, like season 6, I'm thinking.
Oh, yes. I'm coming back for that episode. I assume that's already scheduled. It's on my calendar. So I don't know if I told you about it, but...
Oh, okay, good. I'm glad you let me know. We'll definitely have you back for the Captain. I have not had anyone else say I want to talk about how I want to see Captain Carrot in Young Justice. But, all right. Man, well, that episode went from like, I don't know, how much are we going to discuss about Shazam? Let's give it a try and see what happens, to a deep philosophical conversation about pretty much everything and how powers relate to the stories that are being told, what not to focus on, what to focus on, and the importance of looking deeper in each of these analyses. Thank you so much for coming back, Kris. This was fascinating for me. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope our listeners enjoyed themselves as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So where can people find you here on Earth Prime?
Well, you can go to the Tumblr for the Gameable podcast. It's at gameabledisneypodcast.tumblr.com. Gameable is spelled Gameable. And that's where you can find links to all of our old episodes all the way back to Snow White. That's the main place. But if you want to follow us on Twitter, you can also go to @GameablePodcast to catch all the new episodes that come out. If you want to check out Mega Dumbcast, that is on Podbean as Mega Dumbcast. It's on iTunes. It's on Google Play. It's everywhere. So you can look up Mega Dumbcast, all one word. And I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, Gameable Podcast, Gameable Saturday Morning Podcast are all searchable on your podcatcher of choice.
Yeah. And the most recent episode I had listened to was the Scooby-Doo episode, which had just released, I think, just before we recorded last week, right? And the part 2 aired today, I think. Is that right? Or yesterday?
The game that we played, I played a game with Lorelei from Good Looks, Bad Books where we pitched smut story pitches right. Where we paired characters with the characters from the Scooby Gang. So if you're interested in teenage superheroics, you will have nothing to do thematically with this episode of Gameable Saturday Morning that has just come out.
The first half, though, before you got into the romance stuff, which I haven't actually heard that second part yet, was amazing. So go listen to that, guys. The Scooby-Doo episode analyzing the history of the show and how it came about and like the inspirations behind it and how it changed basically a whole genre and influenced how things like the, Godzilla cartoon was made that we spoke about in the last episode with Kris. It's fascinating, and particularly how you reflected into how you would do particular things at a table, but also writing as well, like emphasizing what characters over other characters and that kind of thing. So definitely go check that out. And of course, the whole backlog of Gameable podcasts the Gameable podcast is amazing. So
thank you.
And you're welcome. Thank you, man. Thanks to everyone for sharing some time with us as well. You can find us on Twitter at the YJ Files, on Facebook at Crashing the Mode, on Tumblr at theyjfiles.tumblr.com, and on our website, crashingthemode.com, as well as our email address, whelmedpodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoy our show, please consider sharing it with a friend. You can also support the show by giving us a review on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. The ratings help other people find the show. If you do leave us a rating, please let us know, especially if you're outside the US. We have to look a little harder to find those. And even though Season 3 has been officially announced, please continue to spread the word to friends and family about the series. #buy YJ Comics on Comixology. Pick up the comics, get yourself up to speed for the Season 3 premiere. And as always,
stay whelmed, everyone.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our hosts are Rich Howard and Emily Booza. Our editor and producer is Neal Powell. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.